Welcome to Reform Thinking, and welcome to The Deep Dive, the show for you, the learner, where we get into the details and the structure of important ideas. Today, we are definitely taking on a subject Lewis himself called, well, probably the most unpopular doctrine in Christian ethics. We're talking about the structural rules around Christian marriage, divorce, and even the governance of the household.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're doing a deep dive into C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, specifically that one chapter where he just lays out his arguments for the Christian view of marriage. And this isn't just, a theological exercise. This is a really rigorous look at logic, at human will, and what happens when that intense but, well, fleeting feeling of being in love clashes with a serious public lifelong promise.
That's a really important way to frame it. Lewis is building a case here, a highly structured argument. He even says at the start that he knows these ideas are extremely unpopular.
He does. He admits it up front.
And he points out he's speaking from secondhand observation, since he hadn't been married when he wrote it. But he says he just can't leave this subject out if he's going to give an honest account of Christian morals. So our mission for you today is to really get into Lewis's argument, to grasp the logical, sometimes difficult, but surprisingly practical way he defines marriage.
A contract of will and a matter of justice. That's so different from how our culture sees it.
Completely different. It's a stark contrast to our modern reliance on, well, on feelings.
Okay, let's get into it. We have to start with the definition itself, which is, it's radical in its simplicity. Lewis's foundation of one flesh.
Right. So Lewis asserts that the whole Christian idea of marriage is built on what Christ said, that a man and wife are one entity, a single organism.
A single organism.
And for Lewis, that ancient phrase, one flesh, isn't just expressing a nice sentiment. It's not poetry. He's saying it's stating a fact, a functional, almost engineering principle.
That distinction right there, fact versus sentiment, that's everything, isn't it?
It is, because if it were just a sentiment, it would, depend on how you feel that day. But if it's a fact, it's a structural reality that exists whether you feel it or not.
Like gravity. It's just there.
Exactly. It's a concrete state of affairs. And Lewis, to make this clear, he gives these two fantastic analogies to show how two different things are actually meant to function as one single system.
I love these analogies. They're so grounding.
They are. The first one is mechanical. He compares the man-woman unit to a lock and its key.
Right.
You look at them separately, and they're just two distinct objects. But when you think about what they do, well, they are designed to be, and they only really work as one single mechanism.
You can't have one without the other for its purpose.
You can't. And the second analogy is musical. A violin and a bow. You wouldn't say they're two different instruments.
Go on.
They are one instrument. The violin can't make music without the bow. The bow is useless without the violin. Lewis is saying that the inventor of the human machine, Christ, told us that the two halves, male and female, were made to combine totally.
Totally.
Yeah.
Not just sexually or emotionally.
No, but functionally, structurally, economically, to make up this single organism.
And that idea, that totality, leads him directly to his pretty uncomfortable analysis of sex outside of marriage. He calls it the monstrosity of fornication.
That is a strong word. The monstrosity, as he puts it, is the attempt to isolate the sexual kind of union from all the other kinds of union that are supposed to make up the total organism.
He's very careful, though. He clarifies that Christianity isn't condemning sexual pleasure.
Not at all. In fact, he compares it to the pleasure of eating. There's nothing at all wrong with enjoying your food. It's a good gift.
But the moral error happens when you try to isolate that pleasure, to get it by itself, separate from its actual purpose. And this is where he gives that incredibly powerful analogy, the one that really sticks with you.
It really does, because it's so visceral. It defines the problem not as, being a prude, but as a form of consumption and waste.
Go on, lay it out.
Lewis says you must not isolate sexual pleasure any more than you should try to get the pleasure of taste without swallowing and digesting. That is, by chewing things up and then just spitting them out again.
Let's just pause on that for a second. That image is so telling about his view of human design. For you, the learner, just think about that. Chewing and spitting. You get all the sensory pleasure, but you completely thwart the purpose.
You thwart the purpose,
Yeah.
which is nutrition, sustenance, life.
So if we apply that back to marriage, Lewis is saying the sexual act is designed not just for pleasure, but to bond two people into a permanent, total, life-giving thing, that single organism.
Precisely. So when you extract the pleasure and go after it on its own, apart from the total union, it becomes, well, it becomes a disposable act. It's functionally like chewing and spitting. You're frustrating the whole design of the machine.
It's about fragmenting what's meant to be whole, taking apart and rejecting the system it belongs to.
And when you ground the argument in this kind of structural design, instead of just rules or feelings, the next logical step, permanence, becomes basically unavoidable.
Right. So if marriage really is a single organism, a factual combination,
Eh.
then its very nature demands permanence. The Christian teaching is that marriage is for life.
It is. Now, Lewis is intellectually honest here. He knows there have been disagreements between different churches on this. Some deny divorce completely. Others might allow it reluctantly in some very extreme cases.
Sure, like desertion or something.
Exactly. But he's quick to say that this internal debate is tiny compared to the main point of agreement.
Which is?
That all the churches agree with each other far, far more than any of them agree with the outside world on this.
Ah, okay.
And that shared view centers on how they see divorce itself. It's not a simple administrative process. It's not just a readjustment of partners.
His descriptions are. They're graphic.
They are. He says divorce is seen as something like cutting up a living body.
A surgical operation.
Or having both your legs cut off. It is the severing of something that has become structurally one. It's a catastrophe.
And that language is clearly meant to be a shock to the system because it's so different from the modern idea that divorce is just what you do when you fall out of love or, fall in love with someone new.
He's setting up the battle right from the start. Divine structure versus volatile, subjective feeling.
And then he does something really brilliant strategically. He anticipates that some people are just not going to buy his arguments about chastity and sexual morality. So he pivots.
He shifts the entire discussion away from sex and onto the virtue of justice.
It's a masterful move because whether or not you accept the theology of the single organism, you can't really argue with the need for justice. That stands on its own.
It does. Justice, Lewis reminds everyone, includes keeping your promises.
Simple as that.
Every single person married in a church makes a public, solemn vow to stick with their partner until death. And the duty to keep that promise exists on its own terms, just like any other contract.
So he's saying if the sexual impulse is just like any other impulse, which is what modern thought often claims,
then it has to be controlled by promises, just like our impulses about money or power. And he adds that if that impulse is, in his words, morbidly inflamed in our culture, then we have to take special care to make sure it doesn't lead us into dishonesty.
Which brings us to his absolutely blistering critique of perjury. The idea of making a vow you don't intend to keep. He just asks, who were you trying to deceive?
And he just walks through the options with that classic Lewis logic. Were you trying to fool God? Well, that's unwise. Yourself. Not much better. Your new spouse, their family, that's just treacherous.
But his usual diagnosis is that it's all about public image.
Yes. He says they were hoping to deceive the public. They wanted the respectability that comes with marriage, the social status, without paying the price.
The price being permanence and fidelity.
Right. He says they were imposters, they cheated the social contract. And he says if people are just happy being cheats, well, he doesn't have much to say to them. You can't talk about higher virtues if someone hasn't even grasped basic honesty.
But for the person who does want to be honest, his conclusion is, it's just staggering. It really turns things on their head.
It does. He says if people genuinely don't believe in permanent marriage, it is perhaps better that they just live together unmarried.
Wait, say that again? He says it's better to live together?
Yes. In Christian terms, they'd be guilty of fornication. But Lewis argues that unchastity is not improved by adding perjury to it. You don't fix one fault by adding a lie, a broken solemn promise.
I have to stop on that because that just completely flips the modern script. Lewis is saying that for a Christian, breaking a public, solemn vow dishonesty, perjury is structurally a worse sin than the private sexual act.
He's prioritizing the integrity of the public vow, the contract.
Above the physical act itself.
Exactly. For Lewis, fidelity to your word is a matter of universal justice, and justice is the foundation for all the other virtues. If you can't be trusted to keep a vow you made before God and the state, how can your character be trusted anywhere else? The perjury undermines the whole moral order.
So this argument about justice naturally leads us to the core conflict he wants to address. The cultural tyranny of the feeling of being in love.
Right. He argues that if being in love is the only reason to stay married, then marriage as a contract or a promise, it just makes no sense.
Why bother with the promise?
If the feeling is everything, the promise adds nothing. Its expiration date is just your next strong emotion. And if the promise adds nothing, Lewis says, then you shouldn't make it.
And what's so fascinating is he says that real lovers in the moment actually know this better than the people who just talk about love. He quotes Chesterton here.
He does. The observation is that lovers who are really in love have this natural urge to bind themselves with promises.
It's true. You think about every love song ever written. It's all vows of eternal constancy. I love you forever.
No one writes a song that says, I'll love you until this feeling wears off. So the Christian law, Lewis argues, isn't adding some weird restrictive rule. It's just asking lovers to take seriously what their own passion is already pushing them to do.
Which is to make the union permanent with a vow.
Exactly. And that explains the whole point of the vow. The promise, which you make when you're in that state of high feeling, commits you to actions even if that feeling fades. Because a promise has to be about something you can control.
That is the key. Feeling versus will.
You can't promise to keep feeling a certain way. You can't promise you'll never have a headache. Feelings are not voluntary.
But actions are.
Actions are. The vow covers fidelity, support, care, justice, all things you can choose to do no matter what your emotional temperature is on a given Tuesday.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate here for the listener. What is the actual value of forcing two people to stay together if that romantic feeling is just gone, when it feels like a dry, empty contract?
Lewis gives a few layers of answers. First, there are the practical social reasons. You need to provide a stable home for children. That's a primary duty.
And protecting the woman.
Yes. Protecting the woman, who he points out has often damaged her own career by marrying, so she can't just be dropped when the man gets bored. These are duties of basic justice.
But there's a deeper reason, right? The one he says he's very sure of.
Yes, and it requires us to rank our impulses. We have to think in terms of good, better, and best. He says you can't just take one single impulse of your nature, even a noble one like being in love, and make it the absolute thing you follow at all costs.
And he ranks being in love pretty high on the scale.
Oh, he does. He says it's a glorious state. It makes us generous and courageous. It conquers lust. He says it's far better than just cold self-centeredness. But it is not the best thing. It's good, but it's not the top of the pyramid. It has to be subordinate to the virtues of the will and duty. You just cannot build the entire structure of a life, a family, a covenant on a temporary, involuntary feeling. All feelings, by their nature, are unreliable.
And that gets us to the very engine of his argument, the essential unreliability of feelings. He just observes that no feeling, no matter how intense, can be counted on to last.
Feelings just come and go. So what's left to hold up the structure? Lewis says knowledge can last, principles can last, and habits can last. These are the things that create continuity.
But the state of being in love, with all the thrill and the glamour, that usually doesn't last.
It doesn't. And he says that cultural myth that they lived happily ever after, if that's supposed to mean they felt the same excitement for 50 years, well, that's not only false, it would be horrible if it were true.
Horrible.
Think about it. Who could stand to live in that state of high-pitched excitement for even 5 years? He says it would destroy your work, your appetite, your sleep, your friendships.
It's totally unsustainable.
It's designed to be a catalyst, an explosion to get things started, not the fuel you run on forever.
So here's the big distinction. Ceasing to be in love does not mean ceasing to love.
Exactly. And he defines that second, quieter, more stable kind of love. Love, the verb, is not a feeling. He says it's a deep unity.
And how is that unity powered?
It is maintained by the will, and it is deliberately strengthened by habit. And in a Christian marriage, it's reinforced by the grace they ask for and get from God. That's the power source for the structure.
So this kind of love, this willed love, can exist even when the couple doesn't particularly like each other.
Right. Which is a reality in any long-term relationship. He compares it to how you love yourself. You don't just abandon ship when you're disgusted with something you've done. You still love yourself.
That's a great comparison.
The initial feeling, the being in love, that was the beautiful explosion that started it all. But this quieter, more sober love, the one strengthened by the will, that is the consistent, reliable engine the marriage runs on. It's what allows them to keep the promise they made back in that more volatile state.
The tragedy, as Lewis sees it, is that people get this idea from novels and films that if you just marry the right person, that initial thrill will just last forever.
And so when it inevitably fades, they think they've made a terrible mistake. and that they're now entitled to a do-over.
Which just leads to a cycle.
A completely self-defeating cycle. They change partners, and guess what? The glamour goes out of the new love just as it went out of the old one. Thrills, he says, are for the beginning of things. They can't last if you're trying to build something with substance.
He has that great analogy about learning to fly or moving somewhere beautiful. The thrill of being in the air fades once you have to actually master the hard work of being a pilot.
Or the thrill of the beautiful view fades when you have to deal with local taxes and a leaky roof. The point is, losing the first thrill isn't a failure. It's a necessary transition. It gets replaced by a quieter and more lasting kind of interest, the actual mastery of the thing.
And he says something really interesting here about human nature, that the people who are most willing to let go of that first thrill and settle into the sober work, they're the ones most likely to find new thrills in other places.
Yes. The pilot who masters flight then discovers a passion for music. The person who settles into the landscape discovers gardening. The human need for novelty isn't killed, it just gets redirected into new disciplines, which allows the central structure, the marriage, to remain stable.
And he connects this to a deep spiritual principle. He says this is part of what Christ meant when he said, a thing will not really live unless it first dies.
It's that act of self-denial for the sake of a greater, more lasting reality. If you're always trying to prolong the thrill artificially by chasing novelty, you just make the thrills weaker and you end up bored.
It's better to learn to swim than to keep trying to get back the feeling you had when you were a little kid just paddling at the edge of the water.
A perfect way to put it. You shift from focusing on the feeling to mastering the action.
The last thing Lewis tackles on this front is the cultural myth about the sheer irresistibility of falling in love. The idea that it's like catching the measles, you have no choice.
Right. And he says this belief causes married people to just throw up the sparks the minute they feel an attraction to someone new.
But Lewis pushes back on that idea of inevitability.
He does. He says he's inclined to think that these overwhelming, irresistible passions are actually much rarer in real life than they are in books. Of course, we meet attractive, admirable people. We should admire their good qualities. That's a good thing.
But he questions the choice involved.
He asks if it's not very largely in our own choice, whether that admiration turns into the all-consuming feeling of being in love. We choose our environment, and our environment shapes our emotions.
So if your mind is just saturated with sentimental novels and songs,
or your body is full of alcohol, as he puts it, then you will naturally turn any admiration into that kind of disruptive love. It's like wearing blue glasses. Everything looks blue. But Lewis concludes, that's our own fault. We've created the conditions for that to happen.
Okay, so after laying all of that out, the Christian idea of marriage as this permanent will-based thing, Lewis shifts gears completely. He wants to separate two questions that often get mixed up.
A really important distinction to make. We've just covered question 1. What is the Christian view of marriage? Question 2 is very different. How far should Christians try to force that view on the rest of society through divorce laws?
And his answer might be surprising to some.
It might be. He is very clear. He opposes trying to coerce non-Christians into a Christian form of marriage. He says he'd be very angry if Muslims in England tried to pass a law preventing everyone else from drinking wine.
So his political suggestion is actually pretty pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. He says the churches should just be honest and recognize that most people in a modern state are not Christians, so you can't expect them to live Christian lives. That's illogical.
So what's his solution?
A two-tier system. He suggests there ought to be two completely distinct kinds of marriage.
One would be just for the state, a civil contract.
Exactly. Governed by the state with rules for all citizens, and it would likely allow for divorce based on whatever the civil contract says. That's the government's business.
And the second kind?
The second would be governed by the church, with her own strict rules of permanence and duty, but enforced only on her own members. The goal is to make the distinction sharp, so everyone knows who is married in the Christian sense bound till death, and who is just operating under a civil agreement.
It preserves the integrity of the Christian vow without forcing it on anyone else.
Exactly.
All right, finally, we have to get to the other, and maybe even more unpopular, doctrine he talks about. Headship.
The really controversial one.
The idea that wives promise to obey and that the man is the head. Lewis breaks this down into two very structural questions. First, why have a head at all? Why not just have perfect equality? And second, if you need one, why the man?
So on the first question, why a head, Lewis argues it follows directly from the idea of permanence. He hopes and assumes that most of the time in a good marriage there's total agreement, so the question of a head never even comes up.
That's the ideal.
But in a permanent partnership, there will eventually be real, honest-to-goodness disagreements where you just can't find a middle ground. You've talked it over, but you still don't agree.
What to do then?
Well, you've only got two options. Either you separate, which violates the permanence, or one person has to have the final casting vote to break the deadlock so the family can move forward. He says you simply cannot have a permanent association without some kind of constitution.
So it's not about one person being smarter or better. It's an organizational necessity to avoid paralysis.
Precisely. Which brings us to the second, harder question. Okay, if there has to be a head, why the man?
And he starts with a cultural observation.
He asks if there's really a serious wish for it to be the woman. And he observes that even women who rule their own homes don't seem to admire that arrangement when they see it next door. They say things like, "Poor Mr. X, I can't imagine why he lets her boss him around like that."
He's suggesting there's something unnatural about it, that even the people involved are sort of embarrassed by it.
That's his observation. But then he gives the structural reason, which he calls the foreign policy rationale.
Okay, this is the crucial part. The family's relationship with the outer world, its foreign policy, has to depend on the man. Why?
Because, he says, the man always ought to be, and usually is, much more just to the outsiders.
And the woman's priority is different.
Fundamentally different. Her primary role, and he says this is almost a good thing, is to fight for her own children and husband against the world. She is the special trustee of her family's interests, and those interests tend to override everything else for her. It's an intense family patriotism.
So the husband's job is to, counterbalance that?
Exactly. His function is to make sure that the wife's intense and sometimes biased loyalty to her own family isn't given total control. He has the last word to protect other people, the neighbors, the community, from the family's powerful self-interest.
He gives a couple of really simple examples to make this concrete.
He does. He asks, if your dog bites the neighbor's kid, or your kid hurts the neighbor's dog, who would you rather have to deal with? The master of the house or the mistress?
The assumption being the man will be more objective.
More impartial, less emotionally defensive of his own family's actions. He even asks married women directly, isn't your husband's chief failing that he's a bit of an appeaser? That he doesn't stick up for the family's rights against the neighbors as strongly as you'd like?
That very quality.
That very quality. The man's greater concern for a broader, more abstract justice, even if it's not to his own family's immediate advantage, is exactly why Lewis argues he needs the casting vote on foreign policy. It's not about being better. It's about having a different and necessary constitutional function.
Wow. That is a lot to process. This has been a really rigorous dive into Lewis's view of marriage from mere Christianity. For you, the learner, I think the key takeaway is that Lewis gives us this clear, if challenging, logical framework. Marriage is a fact, a single organism. And its success depends not on that first feeling, but on the disciplined, ongoing exercise of the will, keeping a promise and building habits. All of which is basically the virtue of justice.
He really forces us to do a reality check. He's asking you to evaluate your life based on what you actually know about discipline and permanence, not on ideas you got from movies that put a thrill up on a pedestal. For Lewis, ceasing to be in love isn't a failure. It's the normal, necessary death of the first stage. It's the dying that lets true, stable, will-based love, the structural engine, actually grow.
The ultimate distinction is between the marriage started by a temporary explosion and the one sustained by a permanent engine. It's a definition of love that requires work, habit, and choice.
So, if Lewis is right, if true love is a deep unity that you maintain with your will and strengthened by habit, you have to ask, how does our culture's focus on spontaneous, irresistible feeling affect our ability to practice virtues like patience, loyalty, and self-control in every other part of our lives?
That's a great question. Think about any habit you need for lasting success, starting a career, learning an instrument, even building a tough relationship at work. They all start with some excitement, but the real achievement only comes after that feeling fades and the structure of your disciplined will takes over. What other habits in your life, besides just marital fidelity, require the death of that initial thrill to truly succeed? That is where real life and true mastery really begin.